Good morning, 7 East.
Welcome to Tuesday, everybody. This is going to be a straight-to-the-point episode of LEPRE Radio today. I am going to help you with this assignment. Some of you may have noticed that this assignment is a little bit more difficult than ones in the past. That is true. I'm trying to up my game a bit. I got to make things a bit more challenging. You're going to 8th grade and less than 30 days of school. Try to make things more challenging, kind of make it more enriching. We'll call it that. So episode 36 takes us into the age of reform. We are on the air. First things first, our daily countdown, which may actually be less than we think. And 2, Reform Movement's reading assignment, where I'm going to read through the whole thing, and I'm going to kind of pause or comment on certain things that might be useful for you when doing the Reform Movement's assignment. So we are now on Tuesday, second day of our school week. No new assignment, although this one is still should be worked on if you haven't done so already. And it is 28, the number of the day, my age, and also the number of days in school remaining. Could be less. I'm not sure, though. Let's stay safe for 28 until we know otherwise. So while we are on the air, I'm going to X out of my radio presentation and go to our Reform Movement's reading. Let me Control plus this. Okay. So, reforming America at a time of change and expansion. Remember, reform means to fix, update, improve something. We at school are going to have to do a lot of reform to get us ready for September. A lot of updating and improvements need to be made in time before the summer's over in order to meet all these new challenges that the coronavirus is forcing us to face. So I'm going to read through the reading. You can listen to it and look at the questions if you want, if you find that easier, or you can read along with me. All up to you. Reforming America in a time of change and expansion. Introduction. Imagine all that happens when a family moves into a new house. This sudden expansion into a new home brings a lot of change with it. Kids want to claim certain rooms as their own. Boxes must be unpacked, furniture moved, items organized. Rules and chores need to be established for keeping the house organized and clean. All of these changes can wind up creating one big chaotic mess that takes a while for a family to get under control in their new home. These big and sudden changes often lead to calls for what we call reform. To reform something means to fix, improve, or update it so that it can work in a new setting or after many changes. Every family and every household goes through some kind of reform during any big change, like moving into a new place. What can be said for families can also be said for entire countries, and the United States is no exception. Question 1 should already be answered by now. The huge changes America went through in the early and mid-1800s resulted in so many new problems and opportunities that many Americans could not have ever predicted. These changes brought challenges with them that led to calls for an age of reform during America's westward expansion. These efforts at reform reached every level of American life, ranging from politics to religion. Some of the aspects of American society that underwent the most change were related to education, the roles of women, and the status of slavery in the United States. Question 2 should also be answered by now. Education. Today we just assume every young person goes to school, and there's a reason for that. It's the law. Today every child in America not only has a right to a basic education, but they are obligated to attend some form of schooling, meaning you have to. This, however, was not always the case. For much of America's early history, education of any kind was a rare thing reserved for those who could afford it. This isn't even counting college, which was so exclusive that only the rich and powerful could send their kids to a university for a college degree. Things started to change in the 1800s when many reformers in the United States noticed that something had to be done about America's fast-growing population. Most children work with their families, but those who were orphaned or had nowhere to go were often forgotten and left to the margins of the society, meaning left out on the side, usually winding up as criminals. Reformers like Horace Mann believed America needed to change how it saw education to help the younger generations. Mann believed education should be funded through taxes and offered to everyone in a neutral way so that it could be as inclusive to America's diverse population as possible. By providing this education through taxes and making it universal, meaning for everyone, man thought this system would benefit the country by helping to raise informed and educated citizens. It was in this spirit that the American public education system began to come into existence in the early 1800s, with every state eventually coming to pass universal and compulsory, meaning you're forced to, education laws. So if you don't like the fact that you have to go to school, blame Horace Mann, because he was kind of the driving force behind getting people to have mandatory schooling. Now, on the questions for the assignment, we would have already gone through 1, 2 in the first section, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we should have done 6 questions by now based on what I've read. So if you missed something, go back. Now I'm going to continue on to the next paragraph, which will be the focus of question 7. During this time, American colleges began to rise in number as well. New technologies created opportunities and programs for universities to offer new generations of students who had the strong background of a growing public education system. One part of the government that took these efforts at education reform very seriously was the military. In 1817, Colonel Sylvanus Thayer brought many reforms to the U.S. Military Academy in West Point, New York. Thayer turned West Point into a model of discipline, organization, and rigorous, meaning tough, academics to improve the military's future leadership and the country as a whole. During this time, West Point was also known for its great engineering program, at one time being the only engineering program in the country. Many future leaders in the military, including 2 future presidents, wound up graduating from West Point and benefiting from the reforms in education that were sweeping the country. So West Point, it's actually not too far from where we are. It's a really amazing place to visit. They have one of the best museums. Mr. Bowen's son went to West Point. It's really a great visit, so if you ever have the chance to go, I would take it. Now on to the next paragraph, and question 8. Women's rights. The early 1800s were also a huge turning point for the status of women in the United States. In the colonial and revolutionary time periods, traditional gender roles and the status of women as second-class citizens tended to exist much as it had back in Europe. In the early 1800s, however, the country's westward expansion would wind up bringing about big changes. When families began making the long journeys west in the early and mid-1800s, one thing was made crystal clear. Surviving meant that everyone had to work. The pioneers on America's frontier didn't have the luxury of allowing some people to remain in the home. Sometimes there wasn't even a home to remain in, if you were living out in the Oregon Trail, for example. This meant that men, women, and children all had to do hard physical labor to ensure their own survival and success when they moved out west. For many women, this was an incredibly freeing opportunity. Back east, they would have been forced to remain in the home, but out west, they got to work alongside men and prove they could be just as capable and essential in moving American civilization out into the western frontier. As a result, it was actually some of the youngest and newest states created out west that were the first to grant women the right to vote. Question 8. Now we're on to question 9. Even though women's rights made the most progress out west, this didn't mean nothing was happening back east. In fact, one of the biggest events in the history of the women's rights movement happened in New York State. In 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention became the first women's rights convention in U.S. history. At this convention, women's rights advocates like Elizabeth Cady Stanton formally called for equal rights with men and began the organized movement for women's suffrage, which means voting rights. Suffrage means voting rights, which is a revolutionary moment for civil rights in America. Taking inspiration from the Seneca Falls Convention, states out west began to grant women voting rights, which would become universal across the country under the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So now we are on to the final 4 questions. So we've done the previous 11 so far. So if you missed anything, rewind or go back and read again. Now our last section, slavery. Although there were major changes and reforms in education and women's rights during the early 1800s, the issue that had the most controversial, meaning something people disagree about, and immediate impact on the country was the issue of slavery and efforts to abolish or outlaw it. To abolish something means to get rid of it or outlaw it. Since the beginning of the formation of the United States as a country, slavery had been the biggest point of disagreement between the states that formed the Union. By the mid-1800s, slavery was only popular or legal in one section of the country, the South. No area of the country kept slavery legal or had any use for slave labor. Sections of the country like the North never really had much use for slaves. The jobs in the North didn't need a lot of people like the plantations in the South did. Northern merchants and factory owners had more than enough people, and later on more than enough machines, called the inventions, to do all the work that needed to get done. The South, however, was lagging many years behind the North in terms of their development and economy. While the northern states were producing things in factories, the South was still clinging to farming to make most of their money. Under this way of doing business, it made sense to keep slavery legal, because farming these huge plantations required a lot of workers. Slavery was so popular that at one time, 1 out of every 3 people in the South was a slave. By the mid-1800s, things had not only changed economically since the beginning of the country in the late 1700s, things had also changed morally, meaning what people believed was right or wrong. Great Britain, America's earliest enemy, became the biggest opponent of slavery in the early 1800s. In 1833, Britain abolished slavery, making it totally illegal, and used the British Navy to completely end the slave trade. If any ship went to Africa to get slaves to trade, British warships would fire at them. And not just British ships. If you were from America trying to get slaves even after it was made illegal, the British would fire on your ship. Didn't matter where you were from. If you tried to take slaves out of Africa, your ship would get shot at. Many Americans saw what Britain was doing, and they agreed with it. They thought slavery was evil and cruel, and that no country that held up freedom as a founding idea should allow slavery to exist. These Americans came to be known as abolitionists, people who wanted to get rid of slavery. From their point of view, it was really embarrassing that Great Britain, a country with a king, and a country America fought a war to be free from, was becoming so pro-freedom that they abolished slavery, while America, a democratic country, still had millions of people living as slaves. The abolitionists thought America should be a world leader when it came to supporting freedom for all people. The abolitionist point of view began to spread, and by the mid-1800s, slavery was more or less considered unacceptable in every section of the country except one, the South. From California to New York, more and more Americans were becoming opposed to slavery, and this worried Southern plantation owners. The plantation owners knew their math. If slavery was abolished, they would lose their fortunes and the South would become extremely poor. Their entire economy and way of doing business depended on having thousands upon thousands of unpaid workers to farm cash crops like cotton. If more and more people and more states started to oppose slavery, many Southerners worried that abolitionists might soon have the numbers to amend the U.S. Constitution to make slavery illegal. Remember, you only need 3/4 to amend the Constitution. It was this fear that would ultimately rip the United States apart and lead to a bloody civil war in the 1860s, and which is what we get into next week. So these final 4 questions relate to the section on slavery. I'm going to cut this broadcast short today because I wanted to focus solely on the assignment. So hopefully you found this useful. Make sure you hit the submit button as well. There's many cases of people actually finishing it but not submitting it, and then I got to double check to make sure they get credit for it. But that is it for today. This is Mr. LEPRE signing off.